before I introduce our guest today, we have an announcement from Roger Bruin, the editor of the Humanist Association's journal. So I'm going to throw it to Roger for a few minutes to tell you about what's coming up.
Thank
Roger?
you, James. Yeah. For 50 years, the UUHA has published a journal that goes by the title Religious Humanism. Some of you may know that concept as congregational humanism. We plan for the next 6-month period a volume of short articles about groups and individuals who offer significant humanist work or community or services for non-theists, particularly beyond their own immediate membership. The working title is Humanist Work and Communities, a Compendium. We seek suggestions about individuals and groups who write or publish books or periodicals, print or digital, produce online lectures, conversations, and webinars, hold in-person presentations and workshops, conduct weekly, monthly, or quarterly gatherings, and otherwise offer humanist help and content to folks beyond their immediate membership. If you know of such an entity, a humanist individual, discussion group, service provider, or other that routinely reaches out especially to isolated individuals and families, please respond to the journal editor, that's myself, at rabruin.aol.com or by phone at 773-551-8540, and I will put that contact information in the chat tonight. Please provide some contact information, phone, email, website for the entity or individual you are recommending for inclusion. You do not have to provide detailed information about your nominee now, but please indicate whether you would be willing to help write a short article about that person or group in the range of 250 to 500 words. We'll send you sample text upon receiving that. We will collect suggestions for inclusion until February 15th and compile completed articles through April 1st. So I hope you'll take this opportunity, as dozens of people have over the past couple of years, to be part of the process of writing and publishing the Journal of Religious Humanism. Again, the working title, Humanist Work and Communities, a Compendium. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Roger, for sharing that. Hope everyone will take note. So we are so pleased to be joined today for a conversation about humanism and their life and work by Luciano Gonzalez-Vega, yes. who came onto our radar mainly for their recent contributions to the Humanist magazine and online site, writing about humanism in a way that I think really resonates with those of us who are interested in a social justice-centered humanism, a congregational humanism, humanism that really values inclusion, connection, etc. And so we are really looking forward to this discussion today and what we may learn from Luciano's experience and work. So to give them the full intro, Luciano Gonzalez-Vega is a non-binary author and public speaker who writes and speaks about various issues related to history, humanism, and conflict. They are Puerto Rican and raised abroad in Honduras, Colombia, and Panama during times of civil unrest and strife. Luciano has a master's degree in peace and conflict studies from the University of North Carolina. They are also an experienced humanist activist who has spoken at humanist conferences nationwide and appeared on television to discuss issues related to humanism in the United States. Luciano cares deeply about addressing conflict in transformational ways and aspires to help people have healthier, braver, and happier understandings of conflict, of their place in history, to help people be better equipped to have meaningful conversations on a range of topics. And you can find them on social media, on Twitter, as I mentioned, on thehumanist.com and on Only Sky Media, among other platforms. So Luciano, welcome to the UU Humanist Association. We're so glad to have you.
Hi, I'm so happy to get to be here today. So I believe that the best way to start these sorts of conversations is always with a little bit of a biography. I know that James just regaled us with a extremely condensed version of my biography, but I'll talk a little bit more in depth about it because a lot of the things that I've seen and the experiences that I've gone through have helped influence me and have led me to the positions that I have, particularly the concept of action-oriented humanism. So I was born and was raised partially in North Carolina, which is where I live right now. My father is in the Army, and so is my mom, but she retired when I was born. And I'm also going to go ahead and preface this by saying that I have a health condition that makes it so that speaking for very long periods of time sometimes tires me out a little bit faster. I have acid reflux, and it's a little bit of a strain on my throat. So if you see me stopping to take a drink of water, use that as a reminder to stay hydrated. And just give me like a few seconds. It usually passes very quickly. But yes, so I was born in North Carolina, and before I turned 5, I was living in Panama. I was living in Panama not terribly long after Noriega was deposed. And that was one of the first times that I got to see a country recovering from a conflict. Now, because I was 5, that was a very influential experience, but it's not something that I remember super keenly. Unfortunately, and fortunately, I moved to Colombia a couple of years later, and I actually did get to see Colombia when it was caught in the grip of the Colombian Civil War, which only recently, depending on how you define these sorts of things. But yes, I lived in Colombia during the civil conflict, and I am a native Spanish speaker and someone who learned English. So a lot of my early philosophy and a lot of my early points of view were informed by the fact that I was raised in Latin America during times of conflict. My family is Catholic, and I went to Catholic masses a lot growing up. I got to hear a lot about liberation theology, which is a very distinctly Latinx/Latin point of view on Catholicism and the Bible. And when I was younger and I was deeply religious, that was something that helped inform my point of view on a lot of topics. I like to believe that even though I didn't become an atheist until I was in college, some of my earliest views of conflict and understanding that conflict didn't have to be negative, even if there were negative consequences of conflict, came from liberation theology and the idea that conflicts are opportunities for freedom to arise, which is a very rough overview of a very complex theological topic. I don't know if anyone here is also an ex-Catholic, but it definitely informs a lot of people's points of view for a long time. I was raised Catholic, and then during part of the time that I was Christian, I was a evangelical Christian because my family sent me to a private Christian school in North Carolina, and that really helped shape my theology because that was when I was starting to get old enough that I was starting to have divergent points of view on my faith compared to my family. And going in those spaces and seeing different understandings of things like scripture and also pop culture, because the space that I was raised in was a very, I feel like I could say negative space, but I don't know if that's fully fair, although lots of the individual beliefs that they had were negative. Growing up, those sorts of things and the spaces that I was in allowed me to see things from a range of different points of view, especially because by the time I went to college, which was actually where I officially deconverted, I was starting to become a non-believer already. I had started that journey when I was living in Honduras, and by the time I left, I was in Honduras for most of my high school. I was in Honduras from 2010 to just about 2013. And I got to see, among other things, the aftermath of the Honduran constitutional crisis and also the rise of a future dictator of Honduras, a man by the name of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who basically shredded the country's constitution and then used that as a pretext to stay in power for an additional 4 years, which in Honduras is an extraordinarily big deal. They were a country that was routinely ruled over by military dictatorships until 1984, when they had a constitutional assembly and they wrote a whole new constitution that, among other things, enshrined the idea that you were only going to be president once. And if you even broached the topic of becoming a president again, you would be deposed and you would lose all of your power, which is what some people said happened to Mel Zelaya, who was the person who was the president right when I was arriving in Honduras. Interestingly, lots of these different conflicts shaped my point of view of things like politics and social issues, and they made it so that by the time I went to college, I was very interested in helping people address conflicts in healthy ways and transformational ways, even though I didn't have any idea that there was a thing like peace and conflict studies. I didn't know that humanism was a thing. I think that one of the big things that kept me from becoming a full-out atheist earlier was that I didn't realize that there were other Hispanic atheists, and there were atheists who looked and sounded like me and my family. So when I came to the United States, by the time that I went to college and I was beginning to learn about things other than the very narrow worldviews that I had been exposed to, I was already a foot out the door when it came to theism. But as a Hispanic person, lots of people in the culture that I come from and the cultures that I was raised in stay in spaces that are theistic, even when they themselves are non-theistic, because we associate those spaces with community. We recognize they provide services. We recognize that they do a lot of pragmatic, good things for the community. And for us, we recognize that if we publicly become non-theistic, if we publicly step out of the shadows, there are extreme social consequences for that. So for a very long time, even when I first entered into the secular sphere, when I could no longer stomach the lie that I was a theist, which was I was publicly, I officially spoke out and I came out of the closet for the first time. That wouldn't be the only time I'd come out of the closet, but at the time, that was the very first time that I stepped out of the shadows and I talked about my worldview and my personal philosophies on social media. At the time, there were not that many Hispanic organizations that were dedicated to secular people, regardless of whether or not you use labels, regardless of whether or not you consider yourself a humanist, an atheist, even an agnostic person. If you were one of those people and you were a Hispanic person, you had to get very lucky to find those sorts of spaces. For context, the year that I came out of the non-theistic closet was very early 2014. I believe it was March 2014. At that time, one of the only organizations that did work with Hispanic people that was Hispanic focused was an organization known as the Hispanic American Freethinkers, which is an organization that I'm a part of now and an organization that I've worked with in the past that is led by a man named David Tamayo. And this organization is very active in Washington, D.C. They have community lunches and they get together, and they also give out scholarships to Hispanic students who are studying the sciences. I'm incredibly fond of that organization. And when I lived in Washington, D.C., which I did for about a year, a couple of years ago, I was extremely active. In the time since, my health has declined, and I've also moved back to North Carolina. So it has unfortunately been a little bit harder for me to stay active, but I'm so appreciative of the work that they do, because they were one of the first Hispanic organizations that I ever saw that was actively interested in, among other things, the sciences and also secularism and free thought among Hispanic people. That organization was one of the organizations that really changed my life. And they were dedicated to doing the hard work in the community that would make it safer for Hispanic people to be openly secular. I honestly believe, and I think that one of the biggest reasons why I'm such a firm advocate of the concept of action-oriented humanism is that there are certain communities that are very pragmatic and that recognize that if they come out and they are openly secular, they're going to be losing so much. So if Hispanic, not just Hispanic people, but if anyone who is interested in any sort of humanism or free thought actually wants to diversify their communities and wants to gain the support and the open membership of all of the people who actually encompass the rainbow of free-thinking humanists throughout the country and beyond, there have to be people who are willing to put in the work and who are willing to create spaces that provide services. And speaking from personal experience, in Washington, D.C., there are a number of ethical free-thinking communities and ethical culture movement spaces that do really incredible work, that actually create a physical space for people who need it and do just really good jobs of welcoming people into the community and providing services for people that allow them to afford these social and community sacrifices that they'll be making if they say to the world that they are free thinking. And that is something that I think is important for a lot of different people. I myself am a religious / congregational humanist. And one of my dreams is to actually create spaces like that in Greensboro, which is where I live. Although I know that there actually are people who are interested in doing that work here in Greensboro and in Winston-Salem, which is also very close. And I'm incredibly grateful to those people because they are doing work that will make it possible for people like me and some of my friends to come out and exist openly. I think that this work is incredibly important, which was the reason why last year, when I was asked by the American Humanist Association if I wanted to write an article with them and publish it on the Humanist about rethinking humanism and getting and addressing some of the stereotypes that are associated with it and making it more direct and public and visible, I thought that was a really good idea. When I lived in Washington, D.C., I was lucky enough that I was able to work for both the American Atheist and the American Humanist Association. And during both of those times, I was able to meet a number of different leaders and organizers who were putting in the work to create spaces, whether it was physical or digital, because the space doesn't have to be physical for it to matter. We're meeting in a digital space right now, and that is something that I hope everyone takes something away from. I myself am physically disabled, and it is very difficult for me to walk around. So I really appreciate the accessibility of events like this and the ability of people like me to speak even without us going into different spaces physically. But during that time, I helped work on a number of different communities and I helped organize different people all over the country. It was something that was really transformational, and it allowed me to see firsthand what different spaces were organizing and what different communities were in need of service. And it was something that greatly informed the beginning of what would eventually become my philosophy of action-oriented humanism. I think that getting out there and existing in those spaces and being a public resource is something that it has transformed not only my life, but the life of people who are like me, even if they don't necessarily look like me, because I'm a very light-skinned Hispanic person. Action-oriented humanism for me is something that I think will depend on what your abilities are. I'm not encouraging people to do more than they can do or to try and transform the wheel. But among other things, I'm encouraging people to be out in public and to talk about these things when and where they can. I know for some of us, that's a little bit safer than others. As a public atheist and as a public secular person, I have risked and sacrificed a great deal. And I'm very lucky now because after years of working in these spaces, I have been able to make somewhat of a career out of my activism, but that has come at considerable cost to my social networks, to my friends. I've gotten threats. I've gotten emails from people who are very angry with me. People have tried to dox me. The reality is that some of this work is going to take sacrifice, and I don't want anyone to get involved with this if they are not cognizant of that. Because when I first started being a public atheist, I never imagined that that would define my career. I never imagined that there would be people across the country who know my name because of the fact that I used to do things like write for Pathos, and now I write for Only Sky. And because of work I've done with the American Atheists or with the American Humanist Association. But in order for me to begin my career, I had to be a public speaker. I had to write and talk about a wide range of different topics related to atheism, secularism, free thought, and humanism. And in some cases, I had to do all of that before I even had much of an idea of what those terms meant. I really just sort of unintentionally threw myself into the fire. And I did that just by being a Hispanic person who talks about these issues. I wrote about them on Facebook for several months, and eventually I was contacted by a man named Sal, who is the founder and the head of the Secular Latino Alliance. And he contacted me and he was just like, hey, I see that you are a very young person and you are talking about all these issues and you're Puerto Rican. And part of what you've talked about is what many of me and my friends have experienced. We are also Latino free thinkers, and we have been looking to expand our group membership. And right now, the Secular Latino Alliance is a purely digital group that has connections all over the country. We do have more firm membership bases in certain parts of the country. I know in Los Angeles, there is a very large community of secular Hispanic folks. I know in New York City, there's a very large community of secular Hispanic folks. In places like Miami and in other places that are just sort of strong, places that have lots of Hispanic folks tend to have more Hispanic free thinkers. But in my experience, they are all over the country. I've spoken to folks in North Carolina, in addition to Greensboro, which is where I live. I've spoken to people in places like Fayetteville and Asheville, which are, I think, both a little bit larger than here. And I've also spoken to people in Southern Pines, which is one of the areas that I grew up in. And that is a place that only has a couple thousand people. So the fact of the matter is that part of the whole purpose, in a very positive, very grand sense, of being a public resource and having action-oriented humanism is that you get to be resources for people who are going through this and they don't know how to get in contact with those secular folks. They don't know about the other spaces that exist, whether they're digital or physical. I've seen secular communities in surprisingly small communities. I've seen secular spaces in surprisingly small communities. And I think that that's part of what's really neat about this. I think that that's part of what's really fun about being a resource and being someone who's willing to do the work, because you get to learn about a lot of stuff. I've spoken to people who are leaving Amish spaces. I've spoken to ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. I've spoken to family members who are secular and they just didn't want anyone to know, because they know that that comes at a very real relational and communal cost. If you are as reckless as I was and as public as I was about my deconversion, unfortunately, my experience has traumatized friends and family and made them a little bit afraid to leave. And I think that part of that comes down to the fact that I was extremely aggressive. And I don't regret that. I think that that was important, because in my spaces and the spaces that I'm from, such as being one of my friends from the religious schools that I've gone to, I think it's important to show that there are people in those spaces who leave. If you are enter one of those spaces, it doesn't affect you for the rest of your life, at least not if you don't let it. That doesn't mean that it's easy. I have made very considerable, very personal sacrifices in the name of doing the work that I've done. I've lost friendships and I've lost relationships just because of the work that I've done. And I'm a fairly young person. I'm only 28 and I've only been doing this for about a decade. So I know that older secular people are going to have far worse stories than I have, because I'm living in what is probably the best time to be an atheist, at least in recent history. And I'm living in one of the better countries to be an atheist. I follow and have friends who are Hispanic and in Latin America, and I've seen what it's like over there. I've helped organize events and communities in places like Colombia and in Honduras, and I've worked to make sure that those places are safe for secular folks, because there is very real religious persecution. It is not quite as intense as it might have been in the past, thankfully, but many of the Hispanic secular folks that I know have gone through it when we were deconverting, especially if we were public and we were open. And I don't think that any of us really regret it, because we recognize that we're doing it so that our kids and so that our neighbors and so that our friends don't have it quite as rough as we do. But that doesn't mean that it's fun. That doesn't mean that it doesn't come at a very real cost. Also, I apologize if you see me like messing with this. I'm using earbuds so that way when we get to the more talky sections where I'm not just chatting everyone's ear off, that way my roommates and stuff don't have to hear everything. But yeah, it has been a worthwhile journey, but it has come at considerable cost. And I don't know if I would recommend that everyone does it, but I do know that action-oriented humanism, even before I had a concept of what that was in my mind, before it had a name and before it was little more than a seed, it's been worth it. And the work that I've done has allowed me to change my life and the life of my friends and family. I've educated people from my own relatives to people on the other side of the planet about these sorts of topics. And I've been incredibly lucky and also just incredibly persistent to make it to where I am even today. And I'm hoping that this is just the beginning of my career and the work that I can do, because I think that there's a lot of work to do and there's a lot more stuff that I would like to do. But I'm starting to think of very fun ways that I can give practical examples of action-oriented humanism, especially positive action-oriented humanism, before we get into the Q&A section. And some of the examples that I can think of for my own life are, I've really enjoyed making videos. Before my health started declining, which happened about a year and a half ago, I was very active in making YouTube videos and doing live streams. And in lots of those things, I talked about what it was like being a secular person, which is very interesting because lots of people in my community in the spaces that I was existing in were not secular people. They were just people who knew about me and they were friends of mine. And some of them ended up going on their own journeys just because they heard me talking about what it was like being a secular person, and my own journey away from faith, which was a very difficult and personal journey for me. And they were moved by what they were hearing, and they related some of what they were hearing to their own lives. In some cases, people were realizing that they were queer people, which I am a queer person. I am a trans person, and I'm also asexual, and both of those influence and intersect and touch on my sort of action-oriented humanism. Because when I think about my community, I don't just think about humanists. I think about queer people. I think about other Puerto Rican people. I think about other trans people. And I feel like, especially in 2023, that is a very interesting thing to think about. Earlier today, I was following a journalist and I was reading along her thread where she was talking about, I believe it was a bill in Montana that was on the floor. And she was talking about the people who were for and against it. It was one of the bills that would punish people who are trying to transition, especially people who are trying to transition as children. If I can see that, I will believe that I'm going to look it up later and I'll post a link to it if I get the chance, because it was a very interesting thread. It was also incredibly long, but it was very eye-opening to see efforts like that, because there were people in those spaces who were undoubtedly humanists. They might be religious humanists and they might be Christian humanists, but it's interesting when you open your eyes and you consider the full breadth of humanism, the sorts of connections that you can make, especially because I feel like many of them would consider themselves humanists if they knew about that word. And I feel like many of them probably didn't. It was incredibly lucky that I lived in places like North Carolina and Latin America, that I was able to learn about humanism. And it took me doing lots of online work and trying to figure out my personal philosophies, my personal worldviews, before I was able to come across those words. What I was saying, I believe, before we got Zoom bombed, was that I was thinking about my own journey away from faith. And a lot of it had to do with me going on the internet and trying to see if there were options for people who had philosophies that weren't Christianity. I only had a sort of theoretical concept of other faiths. I didn't really know people who were Jewish or Islamic. I definitely didn't know secular people, at least not openly secular people at that time. And that was even when I was in a public university. The university that I went to for both my undergrad and my graduate life was the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And I adore my university, and it has a very active secular community, but I didn't know that at the time because I was trying to renew my faith. I was trying to figure out what I believed in. And it was only when I started searching these topics myself that I was like, okay, so there are words for people who don't believe in things. There are words for people whose philosophies and worldviews are focused on the here and now, on material things, and on like real life conflicts, rather than thinking about things in terms of theology. And I don't necessarily think that theology is necessarily a bad thing by any means. It's just that I didn't know that there were other options. And I know that if I didn't know that there were other options, there were a lot of people out there who, even in 2023, probably don't realize the full breadth of human philosophies and of ideas about the world that exist out there. And it took several years of me doing research before I learned about things like secular humanism, before I learned of organizations out there that were fighting the good fight. Because in the spaces that I was raised in, those ideas were sort of unthinkable. And it wasn't that anyone in my family was actively malicious at least not anyone that was like openly, regularly talking about it. The feelings that people in my family and in my communities had about these sorts of things would only reveal themselves if they were prompted. And because no one knew to do the prompting, no one was able to figure it out. So lots of people were watching me and the reactions I got from my family and friends when they were thinking about coming out themselves and when they were thinking about talking about what it was like being a queer person or being a humanist or being an agnostic. In the time since, a lot of things have changed because when I came out, it was 2014. And the world was undeniably different in 2014. I don't think that anyone now could have imagined the sheer cavalcade of nonsense that people in 2014 have since experienced in the transition between these last couple of years. But it's also been a lot of chances for wonder and for opportunity. And I honestly think that it's a really good time to be a humanist and to want to get active in these spaces. And I'm very excited about things like congregational humanism, because when I think of what a humanist space is, a lot of my thinking is informed by things like Catholicism and evangelicalism. And I like those spaces and I find comfort in the community and even in some of the rituals. And I think that for a lot of us, that might be like a strange thing to admit. But as a Hispanic person, these things were such a fundamental part of my life growing up that it is really difficult for me to imagine my life without them. I very much enjoy the times that I've been able to be in actively congregational spaces. I've been to Quaker communities that I found really comforting, and I've been to EU communities that I found really comforting. I've wanted to go to a UU space, like a physical space. I just haven't been lucky enough to do that quite yet.
Well, we hope you get a chance to do that for sure. I think they would be lucky to have you. You know, I think it's worth noting that the philosophy of humanism originally comes out of, well, what we call humanism in North America originally comes out of Unitarian and Jewish congregational spaces 100 years ago, where they started talking about a new philosophy that could supplant the outdated thinking that so many changes in society and science, et cetera, had necessitated. And so in a certain sense, although there are plenty of secular humanists who are ardently secular, want nothing to do with anything that looks like a church or something, like acting like a church in any kind of way. There's something congregational, I think, in the DNA and the roots of what we know as humanism, the humanism outlined by the American Humanist Association, et cetera, and in the Humanist Manifestos. And it sounds to me like, you mentioned Catholicism. I mean, in my non-scientific observation is there are a lot of UUs who are former Catholics, including myself. And I think it is because people who had that strong sense of church and community miss it and are seeking something like it. So it sounds to me like congregational humanism perhaps is something that could be particularly important for the budding Hispanic and Latinx free thought communities. You think that's the case?
I definitely think that I definitely think that that's a strong possibility. In the spaces that I was raised in, especially in Colombia, Catholicism has like a extremely strong grip on the culture. Curiously enough, in Honduras, there is a very strong evangelical population. And I do wonder, I wonder how long it's going to take for ideas like congregational humanism to really spread into those places. I think that it's an inevitability, especially because there is I feel like a lot of people don't realize quite how extensive the history of congregational humanism is in the United States. I know that when I first started doing a little bit of research, it caught me off guard. I was thinking that it was going to be a younger phenomenon than it actually was. And I actually do, I want to wait until we get to the Q&A section to answer like most questions, but there is one question that I find very fascinating. Richard Green just mentioned that there's a UU congregation in Greensboro, which is true. I just haven't had like the time to go there since I've moved back. I only moved back to Greensboro right before the pandemic. And I was also in a car crash. I was already physically disabled, but being in a car crash, which happened in 2020, really changed just a lot of stuff for me. It has made it very difficult for me to move around quite as much as I used to. But Richard asked if I had a good science exposure in my development, and I would say that I actually did. I think that this is a very curious question that lots of people who either have lots of experience with Catholics or don't have much experience with Catholics ask. Catholicism is a very uniquely structured take on Christianity, and
Yeah.
there is a very strong Catholic scientist community, which as a young kid always was strange to me because I was always a curious kid. And there was never a time in my life when I didn't have at least a few questions about Christianity. I found it very fascinating historically just how many Catholics have been ardent scientists. I believe that I had a fairly strong exposure to science during my personal development, aside from when I was in middle school. And when I was in middle school is when I was in one of the Christian schools that I talked about, and they explicitly taught us anti-evolution, young earth creationism. They were explicit and they were extremely proud of it. They were ardently anti-science. That's the only school that I've seen that wasn't a university that is just no, we strongly dislike evolution and we will not teach it, even though it is technically, at least during the time, I believe it was part of the standards in North Carolina. But yeah.
Wow. So the concepts of action-oriented humanism and inclusive humanism are two concepts that you write about and develop in your work. I'm just wondering if you could say a little more about what those mean to you, and maybe what experiences shaped your thinking about those.
Sure. So action-oriented humanism for me is it's a number of different things, but probably the single biggest thing that it's a response to is the idea that I've encountered throughout my life, where people conflate atheism and elitism, and also secularism and elitism. I live in North Carolina. During part of my childhood and adulthood, I've lived in rural North Carolina. And lots of the times that I've had conversations about atheism, I have had to correct people. I've had to correct misconceptions about both atheism, humanism, and secularism. And Ed asked a question about that I believe that we will get to in a second. But one of the things that I've had to do is I've had to talk about how these are not elitist philosophies. And one of the big things about inclusive humanism particularly is changing what people think of when they think of humanism, when they think of atheism and secularism. And I think that these ideas and these philosophies are more oriented towards humanism than they are towards atheism and secularism. But for better or worse, there are conflations of those three terms in the United States and in a lot of the West. And I think it's important that we recognize that reality and we do our part to address it. Action-oriented humanism for me, just as a disabled person who wants to get people talking about humanism and these sorts of topics, is anything that helps start conversations about humanism in positive or at least neutral lights. These can be things like Ask an Atheist or Ask a Humanist booths, which I've seen more of recently, which is very exciting. I really like the Ask an Atheist Day or the Talk Humanism booths, events, live streams that I've seen over the course of the last couple of years. I think that making these sorts of topics approachable and showing the direct goodness and impact of these sorts of philosophies on society is a very good thing. And that can come in a lot of different forms. I don't want to encourage people to think in any super strict sort of way, because what volunteering and what activism looks like will differ from community to community, even among people who have commonalities in class and race and political views. What it means to be an activist will differ from person to person.
There's been a lot of talk in the last, 5 years or more in the wider free thought atheist and humanist community about trying to be more inclusive, less white centric. And I know the American Humanist Association had those Centering the Margins conferences. I think you told me you had been involved with
Yes.
with one of those, right? And so in terms of your experience with the Hispanic and Latinx humanist, wider free thought world, I'm wondering what you think about how the wider free thought, atheist, humanist, secular community, et cetera, is supportive of Hispanic and Latinx non-theists, and what maybe could it do to be more supportive? What do you think that could be done to make that community more visible in the sort of wider sphere of secularism?
Yeah, so I've definitely had a very interesting experience. I've been able to become visible in part because people were excited to hear a Hispanic person, but I also know that like part of the reason I was able to make the sort of sacrifices that I could make to begin the work in the first place is because of my background. I am fully Puerto Rican. I am also fully white, and that definitely intersects. There's definitely things there that touch on and work with each other. One of the big things is that I think it's a lot easier for me to get certain opportunities than it would be for someone who is Black and Hispanic, whether they're Puerto Rican or Dominican or Honduran. That's not to say that there aren't spaces that are extremely supportive. There's explicitly Latinx spaces like the Secular Latino Alliance and Hispanic American Freethinkers. There have also spaces that people have created just sort of through brute force. Dr. Juan Navarro Rivera is a very good friend of mine, and he is a prominent speaker and activist who lives in Washington, D.C. He is also Puerto Rican, and he has done incredible work on talking about Latinx nuns, and which in this case is people who just don't identify anywhere in the religious sphere. They don't identify with any explicit religious denomination. That is where atheists, agnostics, and humanists fall, but it's also where like other categories of people fall. But that said, that there's a decent number of Hispanic people who are in that community. Last I checked, it was something like 22%, so it was almost a solid quarter of people who are Hispanic or Latinx, because there is like a slight difference, and not everyone who's Hispanic is Latinx, and not everyone who's Latinx is Hispanic. But I think that there are spaces that are doing really good work. There are organizations and there's conferences that have gone out of their way to include at least one Latinx voice. On more than one occasion, that has been me, but there have also been a number of other prominent Hispanic speakers that I've seen. And I'm very happy that we are gradually making inroads and becoming more accepted, especially because lots of us have been working for years in our own insular communities and are only just beginning to really get opportunities to shine outside of them.
So it strikes me that, a major component of action-oriented humanism that goes out and gets involved in what's going on in the wider world, in being visible for atheists and humanists, but also being involved in what you talked about, the importance of being pragmatic to some communities, right?
Yeah.
Of doing things that matter, doing things that help the community, right? So a part of that often, it seems to me, involves navigating interfaith spaces, right? Because a lot of times there are interfaith coalitions and there are communities that figure out how to work together on larger projects. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how it is to, as an atheist and humanist, to navigate those kinds of situations and spaces, and perhaps are there things about that are more relevant or salient to the Hispanic and Latinx community in terms of how the role of interfaith comes into play?
Yeah, I think that that's a very good question, because in my experience, I lived in Washington, D.C., which definitely colored a lot of my activism experience. But I was able to do lots of very interesting and good work with organizations that are either explicitly or softly Catholic, but are like they're cognizant of the privilege and a lot of other things that come with being Catholic, and also that want to do work that reconciles them with other communities and other spaces. And I think that that's very interesting as a Hispanic person. Lots of them had questions for me explicitly, because usually in those spaces and in those times, I was the only person who was both Hispanic and explicitly secular, although regularly there were other people who were very softly secular, and they just waited to see how people reacted to me before they talked about how openly secular they were in their own private lives.
Right. that makes sense. And I ask in part because many, if not most, humanists, part of our community, are have a lot of experience with navigating interfaith spaces and being part of diverse, inclusive communities. Congregations often have very large contingents of non-theists, but are not exclusively so. And so that's something that that is something that we talk a lot about, is how to sort of coexist and how to work on things, but also sort of maintain the identity and the dignity of ourselves within the larger connective tissue. So
we do have, I think, a hand up in the chat.
Yes, so we're moving.
And,
I think we're gonna start moving into our Q&A period. But I wanted to let Lika Lewis Cornwell, who's here, who is our UUHA board president. Lika, is there anything you wanted to ask?
Yes, absolutely. And I know Ed has been patiently waiting to get a question. So I'm going to go ahead and offer my time to Ed's question, which is, how do we reconcile humanism, atheism, and secularism? And then Timothy saw your hand as well, so you'll be next on the Q&A.
So if we're asking my opinion as someone who is interested in inclusive humanism, I think that we explicitly acknowledge the fact that there is significant crossover. I think that we should also go out of our way to repudiate the idea that these three ideas are uniquely linked. I think that we should acknowledge that there is a long history of interpersonal philosophies in spaces like Christianity and Judaism and Islam that are humanistic, or at least that would be if they had an understanding of the term that had positive connotations. Because I think that one of the most important things that we could do is eliminate the idea that to be a humanist, you have to be irreligious. I do think that there is good stuff in acknowledging the reality that these ideas have unique links to each other. But if we get rid of the idea that being a humanist or being a secular person is intrinsically linked to atheism or to non-theism more broadly, we would do a very good job of creating a more open space. That does not mean that we have to accept every bad idea. It doesn't mean that we can't have critical conversations. It just means acknowledging the reality that as much as we are cool and as much as we love our spaces, there's lots of people like us, and that acknowledging that people who are like us exist in other spaces would go a long way towards enabling people to feel more comfortable around us. And speaking as a young humanist, I would have appreciated quite regularly during my college years if people realized that their philosophies and my philosophies do not have to be at odd ends and can in fact mix, mingle, and even marry to a certain extent without any serious problems. As for getting people more accepting of atheism and secularism, I think that both of those have unique challenges. I think it's important that we accept the emotional reality that our ideas are rejections of theirs. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing, but I think that lots of people who are in interfaith relationships, which I've often been in, I think that people will struggle with that, especially if you are experiencing a new faith for the first time. And if you still find yourself quite firmly attached to your atheism in whatever form that takes. And I think that it's often the same thing with secularism, although fortunately, I feel like secularism, when you explicitly separate it from the other ideas, does not have quite the same baggage. I think that when people realize that being secular is being pro-freedom, that it's being pro everyone's ability to believe how they wish, I think that lots of people find secularism to be positive. I've had lots of very interesting, very important conversations with Christians in a wide range of different spaces, even debate groups, where we all acknowledge the reality that being secular is one of America's greatest strengths, that it is a wonderful position that allows us to have important conversations about faith and about tradition and about family in ways that don't make any of us feel bad and in ways that don't drag any of our identities through the mud. Now, as for how do we go about marrying these ideas, I think that for better or worse, these ideas are often quite married. And I think that that can be very interesting because in some cases, I definitely think it's important that we actually go out of our way to slightly untangle how intimately some people feel about these three ideas. I feel very strongly about the intersections between atheism, humanism, and secularism because I am an atheistic secular humanist. And I think that that is one of my greatest strengths politically. I think it's really fantastic that I can talk about these sorts of ideas without disparaging anyone's beliefs. And I can talk about these ideas in ways that allow me to talk about how uniquely American it is for people to live in the same community, even while their beliefs are so wildly different. I think that reconciling these ideas, I think it depends on what reconciliation means in the mind of the person who is speaking it. And I would be very curious to hear, I want to go up so I can make sure I get the name correct. But I think it'd be really cool to hear more of Ed's thoughts in the chat because I want to be able to respond to this more fully if Ed feels like I didn't talk about it in quite the way that he meant. Also, if you pronouns are not he, him, his, I apologize for assuming.
Well, it looks like Ed is still here. Maybe
okay, cool.
Ed will unmute, but if not, I know that it strikes me that in humanist, atheist, secular discussions, etc., there's often a lot of litigating of terms about what they mean. And no, this means that, and I'm this and not that, and no, human. And some people, I think Richard Dawkins notoriously said something like, humanists are just atheists who won't say they're atheists or something of that nature. There's, I always find that there's like a lot of, there's never universal agreement on what these terms mean or which ones should apply to certain people and groups. And my advocacy is always to be as liberal and loose as possible, let people use whatever terms they need to in order to identify and not get too caught up in literal definitions of things. And part of it I feel like is because, right, like we're evolving faster than the language in terms of what we're creating in terms of organizations and meaning, right? In some senses.
Timothy, you had a question, and Timothy is unmuted. So if you'd like to go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I'm super dedicated to humanism. I think humanism has the answers to almost all the problems we're facing in the world. And I'm frustrated because we don't have a voice. We're not being heard. I want to know how we can break through to the mainstream press and get our ideas out there. I live here in Berkeley, California, and people I meet have no concept of humanism. They've never heard of the American Humanist Association, much less the UUHA. We're just not a player on the national scene. Right now, it seems to me that the single person who's doing the heavy lifting for humanism is Steven Pinker. And I'm very frustrated that we don't have in the American Humanist Association, they're not making the news. How do we break through to the mainstream? This is the media age. We're not in the media. How do we do that? That's my question.
Sorry about that. I think that is an extremely important question because truthfully, it's something that's frustrated me as well. I think that one of the biggest reasons why there are so many people who are quiet about things like their own personal religion or perhaps their own more advanced humanistic worldviews, because humanism is about more than religion and it's about more than a religious belief or a lack thereof. I think that one of the biggest reasons why more people are not explicitly humanists is because they don't know what humanism is. I very strongly agree. And this is something that I actually wrote about when I wrote about inclusive humanism, because I mentioned that was the first time that I had ever heard in an article that I wrote for the American Humanist Association. I mentioned that the first time that I ever heard the word humanism, or at least secular humanism, was in The Office. there's a deleted scene in season 3, I think. I'm quoting stuff off the top of my head, and it's just a little blurb. And in it, Oscar, who is a Hispanic character on The Office, talks about being a secular humanist. And that was something that in a lot of ways changed my life, because I did not know that that was really an option before then. And it really is that easy sometimes. But unfortunately, getting the people to say the thing, getting the people to actually acknowledge that this is a position is difficult. I think that one of the biggest keys is that we have to create our own spaces, which is something that frustrates a lot of people because it's not easy to break through the noise.
You mentioned politics a couple of times.
Yeah.
How could we get more political? That's where the action is.
I agree that definitely in 2023, it really feels like politics is the area to be at if you want to be seen. I think that that is both more difficult and easier than it often is, because there is a free thought caucus in the United States, and not that many people realize it, but it is an active political organization that has numerous Democrats in it. It's something that the AHA is very fond of. I say this as someone who has worked for the AHA, and I also really like it. It is really frustrating that they do not do more free thought things, and I wish that there was an easy answer that I could give you, but I think it's important that people on the ground keep putting in the work. And that is going to mean organizations. It's going to mean organizations like the UUHA. It's going to mean organizations like the AHA. And it's also going to mean individual activists, whether it's me and you having a conversation like this that's going to be recorded and put on YouTube, or it is someone having a debate with someone talking about the differences between a religious worldview and a humanistic worldview, or rather an atheistic worldview.
Richard, I see your hand as well, inviting you to unmute.
If you look at the political scene, we have about something between 15 and 30% of the population are, I want to say, religious bigots and racial bigots, and not very advanced in terms of what you're describing. And we've been paying money for public education for a long time, but more than 50% of the United States do not believe in education, in evolution, which is a pretty sad. We've spent a lot of money in public education, and to not be able to sell science to people is sad. Do you get discouraged by the fact that almost half the country is not coming along?
I think that that's a very interesting question, specifically because I was raised in both public and private schools. I went to both public and private schools in the United States and in Latin America, and I got to see firsthand just how radically different things can be. Although I think it's very interesting that, like, I went to school in Honduras specifically, because in Honduras, the way that they approach science education is very different from the way that we do. Among other things, in Honduras, lots of people drop out before high school. And I was in Honduras in high school specifically, so I got to see firsthand just how different the science education can be. I went to spaces where I got to see people having school in English and in Spanish in both public and in private schools, even though the school that I went to was explicitly private. But going back to the United States, I think it's interesting to see just how many people are slowly coming along. And I think that one of the problems with, like, using public education as the barometer is that lots of people who are going to be in public education are still going to maintain their beliefs. They're going to do everything they can to fight public education tooth and nail, which is one of the big things that Republicans nowadays are doing. Very specifically, they're doing everything they can to get people out of public schools in a wide range of different ways, whether it is making charter schools more accessible or creating what are called school vouchers to advocate the idea of school choice. So that way, if you are a child of a deeply religious person, you can still go to a school that is kind of a public school and kind of a private school and can skirt the bylaws and the regulations that would normally make it easier for someone to learn about things like evolution or sex education. I'm trying to keep the answer short, and I'm sorry for that, because these are topics that I could talk about for hours, and these are topics that I have talked about for hours. So I apologize for that.
Thank you so much. Timothy, I see you have another question.
Yes, so I'm old enough to have seen major social changes in the United States, just huge. And for the first time in the history of this country, religion is being de-emphasized, and we have the nuns, I'm sure all of you are aware of that term, they just keep growing. And they're young people. And there is no leadership out there to direct them. There's no programs. I see nothing coming from the American Humanist Association, no leadership to harness this force, this potential force that's out there. We need to think about, seriously, put your thinking caps on, how can we go mainstream? Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I do think that it is very difficult to try and create a space or a community that is very good at harnessing the power of young people. There were numerous organizations that were putting in at least some effort. There are organizations, God, I wish I could remember the name off the top of my head, but there was an organization that specialized in college students specifically. It was a secular organization that basically only existed in like college clubs and in universities across the country. But unfortunately, the pandemic really kind of shook things up. And I'm sure someone else here knows the name off the top of their head, but I am sad that I don't. It's just been so long.
Secular Students of America?
Yes, thank you. They have presences and college campuses all over the country, and they do great work. It is just that, first of all, colleges are not the only places where young people are located. And also, it is difficult to try and get, people in colleges to come to clubs and to stay in clubs regularly. When I was at UNCG, I did lots of secular work, and I worked with our secular organizations in addition to the regular work that I was doing. And it is not always easy, because when you are in college, there is, thank you, Eric, by the way, I wanted to say that I saw the message just so everyone could see it. But they do lots of incredible work. And I know that they're still around. I just wonder how much their programs have shifted in the wake of the pandemic, and lots of people focusing on accessibility, which I have to say has been not the worst thing in the world for people like me. If you are physically disabled, it is kind of nice to see lots of more emphasis on accessibility and lots of different things like that.
And I just wanted to chime in that I think that I wanted to just raise up the fact that you really make an important point about accessibility that I think is important for us to keep in mind. I mean, the pandemic really, that if there's any silver lining or any upside to going into pandemic mode, it was the fact that many of our groups had to figure out how to do online congregating, and that allowed that created more opportunities for accessibility, more opportunity for people who couldn't connect because of their geographic location, et cetera. And I think that there's very much an ongoing conversation about how do we, as we get back to quote unquote normal or something looking like it, how do we maintain that? How do we keep that aspect, that accessible aspect? And you're reminding us about how important that is, especially I think if we're living up to the humanist values we espouse, right? I think we have Emily next with a question.
Thanks. Yeah. And Luciano, I really appreciate your remarks in this forum. This is wonderful. And I'm appreciating that it's accessible, and virtual forums like this are, as you guys have mentioned. I'm just having like sort of curiosity about humanists or non-theists in the pews. And I had the privilege of being raised UU and have always been out and among people and in spaces that are out among, about a variety of views, mostly humanists. My dad was a scientist. I think that's the water I swum in. And so I do have religious members of my family, but I am just very interested in your experiences with sort of, and we can't read everyone's mind, and we don't know what their conscience is telling them, or how many shades of, the non-binary of religious and non-religious there are in the world, and there's infinite shades of that. But I'm just curious, especially in the Latin American experience, where it seems like Catholicism is very baked into the culture in so many ways, maybe more so as kind of a national thing than maybe even sort of here. I mean, probably quite a bit more in some places than in the US. But I'm just curious about your speculation and your travels in this idea, and speaking in spaces where there's like a lot of conformity constraints against people being in their conscience fully. And I'm not saying what's the percentage of people, because like I really believe there's tons and tons of gray, but I kind of have this feeling that there's a lot of humanists in the pews. And I'm just curious about your thoughts on that general topic.
Yeah, I think that that's a very neat topic. I want to try and think about like the right angle to approach this for, because like the Latinx/Latine experience in the United States is wildly different than it is in Latin America. I want to say that in some Latin American countries, it is extremely different from others. Argentina, for example, has the highest population of Muslims in Latin America. It actually has a considerable percentage of Argentina is actually one of the largest Muslim population countries in the world, which is something that surprises people. Honduras also has a considerable number of Muslims. And then in places like Bolivia, there are surprisingly high numbers of irreligious people. Last time I checked, I definitely think it was over like 10%. And I want to say that the last time I saw a reliable statistic about that was before 2020. So obviously there's going to be like a considerable range. I was raised in countries that are a lot more decidedly theistic in one way or another. I was raised in Honduras, Colombia, and Panama, in addition to living in North Carolina and Georgia during off years because of my family being military. So because of that, I was around deeply religious spaces and communities, regardless of where I lived. North Carolina is certainly not the most religious state in the South, but it's also far from like the least religious state on, I want to say, the East Coast. And then Georgia is fairly religious, at least last time I checked, which I think was in 2019. It was pre-pandemic days. I don't know how the pandemic has shifted that. But I was also not the only Hispanic person that I knew in those spaces who was irreligious. In Honduras, there are lots of atheists who are actively putting in the work to create organizations and to create spaces. And I know that the pandemic definitely shook them up, but Colombia also has a history of irreligious people organizing. There's organizations like the Ateos de Colombia and the Ateos de Bogota, although I think that the second one has largely just stopped meeting, at least physically. But there are lots of spaces for Hispanic people who are freethinkers. Unfortunately, if you are like an American Hispanic freethinker and you only speak English, which is the case for many people in the United States for a number of reasons, it is a little trickier to try and learn about Hispanic atheists and Hispanic freethinkers. But I hope that that sort of answer has illuminated a little more than you thought. I know that's very vague. I wish that I had more time to like delve into this. I just don't want any one question to like dominate the whole chat. But if you want to, you could definitely reach out to me after this and I can have a broader conversation with you about that. I'd be more than happy to.
I would just note that, the younger generation, the generation Y and Z, are like non-religious, right? As most of us surely know, are like non-religious in unprecedented to an unprecedented extent in the history of the United States, right? The very rapidly growing non-religious share of the population, it's concentrated in young folks. So communities like Unitarian Universalist communities, the UUHA, other humanist groups really have an opportunity to reach out to, and a lot of those groups predominantly are older, right? But they have that opportunity to reach out. And I think everyone's having that conversation about how to appeal young folks. We also know that among those younger generations, there's widespread, crises of mental health, and there's like socioeconomic struggles. I mean, we have an opportunity to really, be the alternative to the evangelical Christian narrative that so many people are leaving behind. So it's an ongoing conversation for sure. So we have Eric and Helen, I think, next with a question. If you guys can unmute yourselves.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is the best question for you, more for the people at large, but as UUs, we're based in Durham, by the way, so we're neighbors. We helped reconstitute the humanist group at our fellowship, only we chose to call it a non-theist group because people don't know what a humanist is. So it's pretty clear if you say you're a non-theist, people think they know what that means. But one of the frustrations I have, and I just throw this out to everyone, is that we have been saying for years, we need to be reaching out to the nuns, that young people want to hear this, that young people that walk into a Sunday service and see it becoming, our services clearly have a bias toward theism of some sort, some vague new agey sort of theism. How can we get the powers that be in the UU organization to understand that humanism is a message that will resonate with a lot of people out there, especially young people, if they're worried about bringing young people in so we don't die out?
Yeah, so I'll just jump in very briefly to answer that as I can briefly, and then also repeat what I shared with Richard in the chat. Well, with everyone, it's available there, but in response to Richard's comment. There's actually a lot of really interesting research on the nuns and on the nuns' approach to organized religion and the nuns' approach to spirituality. The nuns are not a monolith any more than any group. But it would certainly not be accurate to say that the nuns are uniformly atheist or humanist or secular. However, it is absolutely a focus, I know, for the UUHA and for the UUA as well, based on the conversations that I've had. But as I mentioned in response to Richard's comment in the chat, don't want to derail the conversation with Luciano, and definitely appreciate their time. But there will be some opportunities coming up to discuss UU specific Article 2 and specific focus within the UU on humanism. So look for those opportunities, but we will be discussing that soon. But Luciano, I'm gonna turn it back over to you.
I know that we only have a few minutes left. I don't know if I could get like a thumbs up or a nod. Do we think that we have enough time for one more question, just in case anyone wants to ask? Yeah, perfect. I'm looking at it,
and yeah. I have one to wrap up.
Excellent.
But want to offer the opportunity for anyone who has not gotten a chance to ask a question yet.
I hope that everyone, while there's like a wait to see if anyone does have any last minute questions, I just want to say that I hope that everyone has felt welcomed in this space. Communities like this are often uniquely broad and have people with a wide range of viewpoints. And I feel like that is always the case when I do public speaking events. So I always try to make sure that these spaces are as warm and as welcoming as possible. I hope that having this conversation in my kitchen and allowing you guys to see my nice little porcelain apple in the background has helped with that message of warmness. I live in a very fun situation, so it's very nice to do these things in a sort of like public space. I very much enjoyed the conversations that we've had so far, and I really liked all the questions. I think it's great to hear all of these questions, especially things about getting representation and getting seen. And I definitely think that in lots of cases, people in smaller communities or more localized ones have a little bit of an easier time. I know that in Greensboro, I've helped start conversations about secular humanism and stuff just by doing things like writing letters to the editor where I talk about these issues and where I talk about issues that are important to me. And that is just a favorite activity of mine. I have done, I think, about 7 letters to the editor, and over the last couple of years for the Greensboro News and Record, which is the biggest publication in the area that I live in, and it's like the big area for news in Greensboro.
Great, thank you so much. It's been so wonderful to have you here. The question that I had is, as we're moving into the second quarter century here of the millennium, which still kind of breaks my brain a little bit. What do you see as the most hopeful aspect of humanism, if you wanted to put it in religious terms, the good news of humanism, if I can use that somewhat tongue in cheek. But what are you most looking forward to seeing humanism continue to shape into? I know you've touched on some of that, but wanted to give you an opportunity as we wrap up.
I think for me, I think because of a very unique background that I've had living in multiple different countries growing up, seeing countries in both active war zones and also in just recovering from wars or just beginning conflicts, I think that one of the most unique things about humanism is that there's space for everyone. I have had conversations with people where we've talked about their religious beliefs. And I've even had conversations with people who are deeply conservative, but they revealed surprising facets to their faiths and things. And I was just there's space for you where I am. And I know that to you, that might be unthinkable because you think of me just as an atheist. But the reality is that while every humanist is different in where they prioritize their identities, for me, my most important identity is humanism. And at least my most important ism identity is humanism. And I believe that there is space in every humanist community within reason for people with a wide range of views. I think that in many of our spaces, if Christians wanted to come in and have conversations with us, and if they wanted to have fellowship with us, I think that many of us would feel comfortable with that. I think that we just enjoy being human and being together. And that while the world is often a very divisive place, there's places for togetherness, and there's places where we can exist without worrying about the things that separate us and that divide us, if that makes any sort of sense.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
James?
Okay, well, we're just winding down here. This has been a great discussion. Thank you again, Luciano, so much for being so generous with your time and talking with us today. And I hope we can stay in touch and have conversations in the future. I just wanted to remind our live participants here today, if you're not following us on social media, Facebook, etc., we have the Humanist Association Facebook page. We also, for anyone who enjoys this sort of thing, we have a Humanist Facebook group where we discuss lots of different topics, including the aforementioned Article 2 process, etc., which is a little inside, UUism, but is relevant. And if you're not a member of the Humanist Association, to anyone who's here, you can certainly join at our website and support the work that we do, which includes bringing you programming like this and publishing the very long-running Religious Humanism Journal, which Roger spoke about at the beginning, which is really a wonderful service to the congregational humanist community in terms of the collection of writing and thinking that it puts together and brings to a wider audience. So thank you everyone for being with us today. It's been great to have this opportunity to connect. And Luciano, I just want to give you a chance to have the last word. If there's Lika.
Yes, I was just going to note in upcoming events, I will be speaking next week. Wait, what is week after? Yes, week after next. For the AHA's Speaking of Humanism event. So look forward to hopefully seeing some of you at that event as well.
Yeah. So Emily just mentioned, Emily just asked if I could share where to follow my work or reach out. That would be awesome. I have a public Facebook profile, so if you saw the Facebook event, I believe you should be able to find me through that, hopefully. But I also have a public Twitter. I'll put the @ over here. Just give me like 1 second. I have been holding my computer this whole time because I have a small tablet, so that's the reason why the angle just shifted. If you have a Twitter, that is definitely the easiest place to reach me. But I just want to say thank you both. I want to say thank you to Lika and to James. This has been such an incredible opportunity, and I'm so happy to have this chance to enter your space and have this conversation. I felt so warm and so welcome, and I'm very excited for the other speakers that you guys will hopefully be getting in the next couple of weeks. And I hope that everyone has had a wonderful time. I don't know if I really taught anything specific, but if I changed the way that you think about any of the stuff, that's really awesome. And I can't wait to see you all again.
Thank you so much, Luciano.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.